We are in the midst of a new technological payola.
There are several bills making their way through Parliament right now that will radically alter Canadians' relationship with the internet. And the only consensus about them seems to be that no one is happy. Putting aside Bill C-27, the privacy bill with the new AI provisions that we've discussed before on this podcast, you have Bill C-11, which updates the Broadcasting Act to apply CanCon provisions to the internet. And Bill C-18, an act impacting online communications platforms that make news content available to persons in Canada. Boy howdy, people are pissed. For C-11, you have digital social creators being told by YouTube and TikTok that this bill will tie their hands and ultimately force a deprioritization of their content. You have TV and film creators complaining that the old CanCon laws aren't that great in the first place. Look, Women Talking just won an Oscar, and it's not even considered CanCon, etc., etc. You also have everyone wondering to what extent user-generated content is part of this bill, and why. For Bill C-18, you have small media publications complaining that this is just a payout for traditional dead tree media that's just going to go into dividend payments for the hedge funds that own them. You have Google testing de-indexing Canadian journalism and search results if the bill goes through. Oh, and Facebook threatening to do basically the same to Canadian news stories on their platform. And then you have BetaKit, which isn't recognized as a qualified journalism organization by this government, so it can't receive any of the benefits, but still might be ethered from the internet by Google anyway. And I get it, Google's not blocking people from typing betakit.com into their browser or any other news publication. But this company has 90% of Canadian market share when it comes to search, so let's be real here. And listen, I'm not a fan of these bills. I think they are flawed in myriad ways, some of which you might hear on this podcast. But we're not here to talk about the bills today. That would require a conversation with Minister Rodriguez, who, despite our best attempts, has not been willing to come on the pod. And anyway, while a conversation on these bills is important, there's another conversation that's not happening at all. One this podcast is particularly well suited to having. A conversation about how Canadian content intersects with technology, how governance intersects with technology, and how technology's capacity to affect change at scale is driven not by some technological decentralized utopia vision of the web, but by the business concerns of big tech that run the closed platforms of the internet and intermediate our access to Canadian music, Canadian movies, Canadian art, and yes, Canadian news. I get it. Some people might not care if they see CanCon or content from around the globe. May the best content win, right? It's a fair stance. But we should understand the actual pain points Canadians and all creators have with these platforms. We should understand that they're not technological hurdles. They're the business demands made by big tech, who currently hold all the leverage and all the dollars, and are currently making mob-like threats on a series of fronts because they don't want to be regulated by our government or any government, which, irrespective of the bills in question, is an attack on our sovereignty. Hey there, Canada. It'd be a shame if your news suddenly disappeared. Oh, sorry, creators. We deprioritized you in search results because the Canadian government forced us to show Canadians, Canadian creators. It's an extortion racket. And yeah, with Bill C-18, it doesn't make any sense to have these platforms pay media outlets for links to news. It's a weird payola play. But these platforms are already creating their own payola schemes, and they've been profiting through them for decades. Google is currently dealing with antitrust investigations for completely owning the web ad market. Facebook already requires publications like BetaKit to pay them more money to reach the people that have already chosen to follow BetaKit for news. Hell, even Elon is getting in on the freedom of speech but not freedom of reach game. Facebook, Twitter, Google are not the only platforms doing this. As you'll hear on this podcast, it's obviously Spotify with music and podcasts, and Amazon is doing the same with books. So along with Our Lady Peace frontman Raine Maida, Canadian content creator, and Senator Colin Deacon, we're having a different conversation. Can this country regulate CanCon like the way it did in the 90s? And will that help or harm Canadian creators? I honestly don't know. But we need to start talking about these issues in the right way if there's any hope for positive change. So let's dig in. I think where I want to start is, Senator, you introducing your role on this podcast and what you can speak to and how you want to speak today, knowing for the audience here that you are currently debating two of the bills that might come up in conversation. So we want to carve out just a space for people to understand how you're coming to this and how you want to participate. So there's not a lot of questions about things unsaid, and we just don't ask you like weird parliamentary questions the whole time.
Colin, Deacon, independent senator from Nova Scotia, former entrepreneur, and currently studying and going to see back from the House of Commons Bill C-11, the Broadcast Act, Bill C-27, the Privacy Act, and also Bill C-18, which is our Online News Act. And every market is different today, and we are not protecting Canadians. We can't keep up to protect Canadians at this point. So updating those pieces of legislation are a full-time priority for me in my job. What's really exciting is that we have a much more independent, much more nonpartisan Senate than we've ever had in our country's history. And that means we're focused as folks that are from a whole lot of different backgrounds. We're 50% women, very large BIPOC population in the Senate now, lots of new Canadians, tons of different backgrounds. We're really, we've got a really diverse group that are looking at legislation through different lenses that in the past really didn't happen. I don't think a lot of Canadians know about it. So there's my little overview and sales pitch.
So that's important because I think you were alluding to a caveat that I'm going to have you make explicit here. It's something you said to us before, because on this podcast, we're going to talk a lot about or refer to, air quotes, the government. And you are not the government, sir. You are a senator. So as part of that, you're coming to this conversation, I'm assuming, to participate as much as we want you to participate.
I'm really interested in learning from the three of you, to be honest, Douglas. This is an opportunity for me to share with my colleagues this conversation and say, here's some interesting ideas from those who are, at the coalface that this legislation is going to be affecting. My job is one where, for the first time ever, this Prime Minister has appointed senators by making one request. And we were vetted as being independent, nonpartisan by an independent advisory body to the Prime Minister. And when he selected me, and as I understand it from each of my other colleagues that he appointed, he made one request of me, and that was to challenge the government. We are not the government. We're an independent legislative review body.
I think this is a good transition then into talk to our other guest here. Senator, you had mentioned something earlier, like the laws that you are currently reviewing were made in the pre-digital era. Raine, setting you up here a bit, not only are you a pretty digital forward creator right now, and some of the, I think longtime listeners of the podcast would know that we've had you on before talking about Web3, NFTs, and just how creators are looking to capture new technologies there. But you are also the lead singer, frontman, and songwriter for a very popular Canadian band that has participated across these eras of when CanCon regulation requirements have been in effect. So I'm wondering if you could speak to your experience of CanCon and running afoul of it a little bit to set up why we want to bring you in, not only as someone who's dealing with the bleeding edge stuff, but who has been part of CanCon conversations since at least the early 90s.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here. Definitely one of those artists that have lived through probably a couple paradigm shifts, to be honest. And even as a young artist, learning about CanCon was pretty fascinating to me because, you start playing the guitar, trying to write songs, playing clubs. You don't really understand the support system and how incredible it was in Canada compared to, other countries. So as that kind of became enlightened on whether it was the grants, all the great funding that the government does, all these kind of shared priorities in terms of how we support the arts as a Canadian culture was fascinating. And I think we benefited from it, in the late 90s, early 2000s, like most artists did, even to the point where I think we had a record come out in 98 called Clumsy. And at that point, I think it sold 1 million plus albums or CDs. And at that point, the population in Canada was 25 million, which meant, remember someone said to me, so 1 in 25 people have, this Clumsy CD. I couldn't escape those songs on the radio to the point where I felt like, wow, this is kind of like overplay, in the sense of like, I don't know. I actually felt like maybe this is not diluting the band, but like, are people going to get like legitimately sick of this music because it's being played so much, which kind of led us to make a petition way back then of like, hey, if CanCon is helping drive the number of plays that my band is getting across all these different formats on radio, is it worth us maybe asking to be removed from it? So we just don't overexpose ourselves in a country.
Did you feel as though you were taking advantage of that, or had maybe tiered yourself out of needing that, and you were, I guess, looking to kind of open that back up to earlier stage creators or musicians? Or you were worried about it actually being an inhibitor on your success because you were getting, like, again, for people under 30 listening to this, being overplayed was a circumstance out of your control, because a lot of the broadcast mechanisms we were talking about were doing the curation for you, and you either turned it on or off. So like Raine's consideration here isn't entirely like, it was a common understanding that you didn't want to be too overplayed because that could kill the experience or the excitement or the relationship with your fans, right?
It was twofold. So it definitely was the first where, the ideals to me as an artist and understanding just the amount of work and bandwidth it took to get to certain levels. I felt like we crossed that threshold where maybe, we don't really need to take advantage of something like CanCon, where we are getting tons of play, selling tons of CDs. Everything was kind of popping for us and very successful. So obviously I don't think there was a tier where it's like once you hit that threshold, you're removed from it. So we had talked to our management and some other people about, is there something where we should seriously look at being removed from the CanCon kind of regulations? And then also, what you're getting at in terms of overexposure really, and what that can do to an artist as well, because there's obviously, a downside to that. So it became this real conundrum from us on that album particularly. And you fast forward 20 years and we've kind of jumped that shark where that's not really even possible anymore. So the actual discussion of CanCon, I feel like it's in a huge transition phase. How artists are supported in Canada, obviously with the Bill C-18 and those shared priorities, I think we're, redefining them as we go.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting here that as a young person in the 90s, pre-Clumsy, were it not for seeing your music videos on Much Music, I think probably the Naveed one particularly, I don't know why that stuck in my brain so much. It was an awesome video and very visually interesting. Coming from Northern Ontario, where bands would have to drive through my hometown but wouldn't stop to play. In fact, the Tragically Hip once wrote a song about how terrible of an experience performing as a band was in Sault Ste. Marie. For me, those channels, whether it was Much Music or 101.3, I actually remember the radio station. Everyone under 30 is like, what is going on right now? Were entry points for me to be exposed to you before even considering overexposure. So it's so, I think, important to kind of connect both sides of that experience. But if I didn't have that access to a larger world, I don't know if I would have found out about you. You had just mentioned about how things now are very, very different. And when you were referencing Clumsy, you were talking about 1998, which was kind of at the peak of CD sales right before the transition. Before I open this up to like the broader group to kind of talk to you about this, I'm just wondering, can you articulate what happened after that point where you were worried about being overexposed? And once the music went not just digital disc, but fully digital and distribution, what that change was like, and maybe what you would have been looking for in terms of support in the early 2000s and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to those early days, the support in Canada and being able to build a foundation and a career here was really important. And I think CanCon had a big effect on that. We were lucky to break in America as well. And so it might have been that kind of like tipping point for us where all of a sudden, we were touring kind of the same venues down here and having the same success, that it felt like, we don't need to kind of leverage any Canadian help anymore. And it should be, if there was a one-to-one thing, it should be whatever ours should be transferred to some other artist that is much more in need of it. Obviously, the paradigm shift in music from physical to digital happened, and with the advent of streaming, I think you have consolidation on both points, because you're talking about a radio station in Sault Ste. Marie, but everyone was either watching much music or if you were able to see MTV as well. So, media has always kind of maybe not benefited by consolidation, but it's always been there. And so what we're seeing now, like I said, you fast forward 20 years and consolidation is happening in social media, and that really is the last bastion for artists now to market themselves. The problem is, or the difficulty is, at least, that these are obviously global platforms for the most part, and so now you're competing on a global stage. There's nothing really regional anymore or national, and I think that's where this conversation really gets interesting, because you can't really regulate an Instagram or a TikTok. You can ban them, I guess, but in terms of pushing Canadian content, which I know is trying to happen, I think on the media front of like a Netflix and something, that's a little bit more practical. But in terms of the social media platforms where artists specific, as I'm a musician, that's where we need to exist.
That gets right to the heart of the matter. So I think right now is a good time to open this up to like the rest of the group here to maybe forward the questions. I will say on the consolidation point, that's a great one, because I think some of that consolidation that happened with digital and streaming, while the technology enabled it, Spotify could have signed the same deals that musicians had when they were selling CDs. That just the terms of those deals don't go to the musicians anymore. They go to the labels. Like, we can get into the business consideration of that, and I really want to hear your perspective on it. But I just want to open this up now to Senator Deacon and Rob to just kind of, because Raine just nailed it. Like, this is the tension right now.
What really blew me away listening to Raine was, as I grew up, so I grew up in listening to music in the 60s and 70s into the 80s, but especially at that time. And what I found amazing was how many Canadian innovative artists, innovative creators we supported in our country, and how I was hearing songs that were from folks that I knew where they were from. I had a sense of their background, and there was a shared identity. And I got to hear them and feel proud about them. And I felt that they got embraced by the country and then got a launch on a global career. That I wonder today if that can happen to the same degree. That's the concern I have. But what really struck me is, as somebody who was an entrepreneur before I got this job, is that I never even tried to sell in Canada in the businesses that I built, because I knew it was impossible. And so we had something in our musical creative sector that really supported globally competitive talent. And we've had it, I think, with book authors and others that have been supported very, very successfully and taken on a large position globally. But we've never done that in broader areas of our economy. And as a result, I think economically, we haven't benefited to the extent that we could when we support creators. But what was interesting is how you saw a need to manage it and saw it as really a catalyst of a career rather than a crutch in the career. Personally, that's where I try to focus. We need to have more ways of catalyzing Canadian creative innovators.
I think that's spot on. And the friction in the entertainment industry, and specifically music these days, it really starts at inception. It is so difficult for artists just to start. The barriers to entry. Well, technology, I can't remember who said it, but, with every great technology, there's always a downside. So the downside is that, yes, it's much easier to potentially make an album because of technology, which is awesome. Everyone can kind of make a record in their basement these days. You don't need to hawk your bicycle or your dad's watch to get studio time. But the entry point and finding a fan base now, because it's become globalized, because it's, like we were talking about before, the only place really to promote yourself is on socials, and these just become much more literally by the week. And this is something I study with one of the companies that I run on the tech side. Conversion rates the fact that artists are being, we have all these unicorn companies that have been built out of Silicon Valley and other places, asking artists and creators to basically accept that shares, likes, and follows are their payment. You cannot build a career on that business model. Talk about something like Spotify. I think you're right, Douglas. Like, if they would have been able to transfer what a CD cost was to streaming, we might be in a better situation, but they just don't pay the bills. So creators need that, like you were saying, Colin, like they need that grassroots support in the early days to catalyze that these are viable artists that are deserving of careers, that deserve people's attention. And we just got to get them from point A to point B to where they have a chance at some sort of exposure and building a community and building a fan base that's sustainable. Because I think the middle class is in dire straits right now.
A couple thoughts. One is it's interesting. So the scenario you painted, Raine, was push, not pull. There was a few channels to receive information. There's radio, there's TV. You sit in your butt and somebody decided what you heard. And now it's completely the opposite. Notwithstanding that Spotify showed up post the Napster, right? Napster was the thing that intervened to drive all the prices to zero, that killed CDs. And then Spotify came around and said, look, we'll pay you pennies on the dollar, along with Apple, who said, we'll pay you pennies on the dollar. So it's better than zero, but not enough to actually make a living. And as we've seen the technology commoditize all industries, we're going to talk about news too, but all industries, the creation costs are zero. The distribution costs are zero. You are no more, I'm nominally a musician too. I just happen to suck. But I may be able to find something that allows me to resonate with an audience via some very narrow channel. But again, to your point, Raine, it's like I am working on behalf of these social media channels or these other platforms so that they may be successful because their business models are about that. So what I'm curious about is, and just for our listeners, we're talking like C11, I'm going to butcher the descriptions here, but C11 is about content and content creation. C18, which we'll probably touch on later, is about journalism. But they're related in a couple areas. One is that, interestingly to me, after reading about this stuff, the CRTC seems to be slowly accruing power in very interesting ways. If all of these passed as written, all of a sudden, I feel weird after having consulted to Bell, the telco, for a while, deferring to the CRTC on a lot of different things, including what content is good and bad. That seems a little strange to me. But also, I really kind of thinking about your point, Raine, if you were magnanimous enough to opt out of Canadian content, like crafting legislation that promotes artists, more about like not stifling them as much as promoting them, not stifling art that's being created or any kind of content that's being created. How do you not saturate and lean on the whales in the network, whether it's news publications, media publications? It's also hard to differentiate because media companies are also content creators as well as the phone company, right? So like the people who own the pipe are also pumping the music to you because they have the deals. So it's very difficult to separate these things out. But in the case that you gave, you've got a few artists who are doing really well, a few news publications doing really well. How do you think, like you've had 20 years to think about it, have you had a suggestion or a thought about how to allow other creators of all these different format types to succeed, understanding the fact that you have so many distribution points that how the hell do you stand out anyway? Can you get there from here? Is that even possible in your mind or no?
I think there's almost like a new awareness that's come into the music sector specifically, in the sense of we might have to just reassess how we define success. And that's not something that's easy for me to say. I have a son who's made an incredible, like literally groundbreaking album as an 18-year-old, kind of over COVID. It's just much more difficult. The idea of, I think you said, Rob, in terms of we've just been hoodwinked into building these unicorns, and they control all our data. They don't share, and like I said before, they expect us to use or accept that shares, likes, and follows are a form of payment. That obviously does not provide a sustainable career for any artist. So the idea for me has been really coming at it from the angle of almost going back to a much more grassroots policy where it's like we need to connect directly to our fans. And I think technology can do that. it really goes back to the days of, putting up a sign-in sheet at the merch booth, kind of like an old punk rock thing where you get fans maybe buying a t-shirt or getting them to sign up so you can reach out to them directly by email. It seems so antiquated, but that really has become the gold standard again. Like the fact that we've reverted back to that, but without that direct connection to your fans, you are going to be hard pressed to build a career. Unless something happens on socials and you blow up and you become a trend. But that's the gap now.
You're making a super interesting point. The whole point of the internet was to decentralize and disintermediate these things. So actually what you're doing is you're talking about getting the intermediaries out of the way, the platforms and whatever, and using the technologies, assembling in the way that you need to directly reach out to your fans. But I guess you're stymied by the platforms that have their own rule set. Douglas, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I was ready to jump on this because this is the but here, right? And Raine, you accurately pointing out that email distribution list back when it was at the merch booth sign up or now run through Klaviyo or MailChimp or whatever is super important. The last time we had you on and we were talking about, why you care so much about Web3, you're like, this is giving me tools to have relationships with my audience in a way that I haven't had in some time. That perfectly stands. To Rob's point though, there are two different components that we're talking about here. One is the discovery problem. And what it means when there were previous channels and gatekeepers that, hey, might have been mandated to play 35% Canadian music, and that's why we had Canadian music on it. But then also got to decide what Canadian music was played to the point where bands like Our Lady Peace or Sloan or others might feel oversaturated there relative to the other Canadian bands, musicians, creators that weren't getting that exposure. But then there's the monetization component, which I want to say is entirely separate. And that relates to distribution. Because Rob, as you're saying, this was supposed to be disintermediated. It was supposed to be open and decentralized. But the technology is separate from the business considerations. And what we have now are a series of digital platforms that are as controlling as Much Music or MTV were in the 90s. Raine, you had said something really interesting about in that transition, the music industry wasn't really able to figure out how to transition the cost of a CD to what we have now. I recommend that everyone listening to this check out, and I think we've referenced this before, a great Decoder interview with Nilay Patel and Charlie Harding, the co-host of Switched on Pop, because what they talk about is the music industry is always searching for the next $20.
Everybody gets it. You go to the store, you spend $20, you buy the CD. You got a bad record contract or not, but I spent $20 and the artist and their label are going to fight over how much of that $20 they get.
Many people are arguing for a pay per stream model. It's simple. It makes sense. It's great for indie artists who are often devalued. It's great for fandoms to make sure that their money is really going to the people that they're listening to. But for Spotify and all the other streamers, it's not great because it means you cannot control your costs.
It's also revealed that Spotify is paying out a huge sum of money for being the de facto platform that people stream music from. It just doesn't go to creators anymore because of the terms of the deals signed with the music labels. And the only reason that changed is we went from one format to the other, terms were renegotiated, and the creators were cut out. Similarly, YouTube is the number 2 search engine in the world, owned by the number 1 search engine in the world, completely controlling discovery. And if you were to ask the now outgoing CEO of YouTube, she would have told you that YouTube is predominantly a music player. Tons of people engage with music on that platform. But musicians have a really hard time monetizing that because the only way to monetize YouTube is to put ads in during your music. And what musician wants to run an ad in the middle of the song? It's absolutely, even for live shows, they never sync them properly. It's always mid-song, not during it's horrifying. So I want to make sure that we're teasing out that relationship between the technology creating discovery portals and who controls that, but then the business considerations around it. Because much like we could get into the streaming TV stuff, I think there was a great Canada Land podcast recently that just came out with Matt Johnson, Canadian director. He's got the new Blackberry film coming out. Katie, just play something from Nirvana, the band, the show, because not enough people watch that.
Super Mario 3. You know what I mean, Jared?
Yeah.
Like every start, you say the lyrics of the... Let me try one.
Super Mario RPG, Sonic the Hedgehog, Donkey Kong 3, Adventures of Lolo 1 and 2, King's Knight, Dig Dug, Juman Fu, Harvest Moon. You write this song? Link Puzzle, Pokemon.
For reference to our listeners, Nirvana, the band, and the show started as a YouTube series and then got bought by Vice. And then when Vice killed all of its video production, so too did the show disappear. I recommend we'll link to in the show notes the CanCon episode about how that component of C11 for television and film creators is fraught. Obviously, we're talking music here because, Rob and Raine are both here, obviously, big music heads. But I want to get to this idea about the tech and the business, because my frustration, the reason why I wanted to call together this meeting of the minds, is I feel we're in serious trouble having poor conversations about where governance intersects with technology. Raine, you had said earlier that it's really hard to regulate this stuff, which I completely agree. However, as someone who runs a media business right now, I'm in a position where both Google and Facebook are threatening to remove access to my news content for all Canadians if they are forced to comply with a law that Senator Deacon is currently observing and commenting on and trying to improve. Digital creators, more aligned to you, Raine, whether they are musicians themselves or kind of mixed media blend, predominantly on TikTok and things like that, are being told by those platforms that if they're forced to comply to these laws, it's going to result in those creators being deplatformed, deprioritized, which I think, we can get into the reasons why, is just a threat to the types of young, hungry creators that you were thinking of in the 90s, Raine, that only know one hand that feeds them and don't want to bite it. So I will leave this to maybe you, Senator, for where you want to come in here, because you're dealing with this stuff now, questions you might want to ask. But I just wanted to bring that back to the center of where the technology and the business considerations enabled by the technology are driving this, because I think we miss something when we focus on the creator, because the creator's relationship with money and their audience are being so heavily obscured and obfuscated by these platforms and the businesses that run them.
I got to tell you, that Decoder episode, the Taylor Swift and the music industry's next $20, that was, for me, that was the most depressing thing to listen to. And I don't make my money from the music industry, but I had no idea how bad it was. And that's not the debate enough that's happening. When we were debating C11, my biggest concern is recurring revenue. In the tech industry, what are you concerned about? You're concerned about recurring revenue. That's the thing that matters more than anything. And when you're a creator, recurring revenue is everything. If you have to individually create every product in whatever form it is, and not be able to get any sort of recurring reward for that, it makes it a very, very hard business to scale. So, I recognize it very clearly in our movie and TV production, in our music production. But it's, for me, the biggest concern is where we come to news and information that is about Canadians, for Canadians, by Canadians, that help us govern our democracy in a sustainable way. One of the best lines I've heard in the last few years is Washington Post's "Democracy dies in darkness." I mean, it just sums up so beautifully the point where we are, because these platforms have been completely unregulated. Government has been so slow to catch up to the way they have disrupted every sector in a massive way. We've been sort of excited about it. I have to say that at times I've been really excited about it, but I haven't understood the implications as we've rolled along, to the point where now, as of today, ChatGPT 4.0 can produce a 25,000 word articulate essay on a topic in a matter of seconds for free. That just scares the hell out of me.
It should. And I should note here, we were talking about this before the podcast. What are the things Douglas is most worried about right now? It's a three-way tie between Google eliminating access to news in Canada, meaning BetaKit basically disappears off the internet for 30 plus million people. BetaKit not qualifying as a qualified news organization, meaning that we get none of the federal support that is currently being worked through, or generative AI just changing how we find stuff on the internet so that no one links to anything anyways. Because what you're talking about, Senator, it is a law of physics that nothing is created or destroyed. Anything here that is generative is being extracted for somewhere else. So the reason ChatGPT-4 can draft that is it has looked at millions upon millions of other essays, arguments, quotes, and data, and it's doing predictive text based upon reinforcement training to know what that next word should be. It's actually not creating. It is sucking things into its system and at best remixing, but at worst actually plagiarizing. By design.
Plagiarizing by design, spreading misinformation, disinformation, and biases at warp speed through our economy and our society. And we're losing humanity, bluntly.
I think my actual role here is evil tech entrepreneur, because that's the thing I've done the longest. So I'm the source of evil, I think, on this podcast. And I think
we all knew that, Rob.
Yeah, I just thought I would pretend to be a senator, a musician, and a journalist. What we've learned over the last decade, and Senator, you pointed this out quite rightly, we're legislating something that has been around for 10 years plus. Google News is not new. It's one of the first products Google came out with. But we're like, we should probably do something about that. So I think there's two things to think about. Number one is change. The pace of change is increasing. And tech companies are looking out for their own interests. I don't think sometimes they're intentionally malicious. Sometimes they're just, it doesn't really matter, because what matters is our bottom line, and it doesn't matter how the sausage is made. We need to make the fucking sausage. So I think that the risk is the decision-making is being taken out of our hands. We have to take some sort of control. But I also think that, so I have some empathy, having built these kinds of companies before. You don't know where your next dollar is, because at least the musicians have audiences. You have no idea with a tech company who your audience is and who your payers. You have a thesis, but you might not be right, and certainly getting it right over time is tough. And what we're seeing with the bigger tech companies like Google is turning into a B2C company. They're realizing that advertisers, they can't saturate anymore, can't get any more money out of advertisers. They are a monopoly or an oligopoly. The only other place to get money from is you and me. That's why they're charging for YouTube. That's why they're charging for storage. That's why they're charging for all this stuff. That is the next frontier for them. But what's worth noting is and this is where I'm very curious to hear all of your thoughts, especially you, Senator, where we can't legislate so slowly based on where the company is at the time, because what the companies are doing is they've gone from move fast and break things to move fast and break society. ChatGPT, AI has been broken up for a long time. ChatGPT showed up and has freaked the crap out of everybody. And you're right, Senator, ChatGPT-4 was just announced today, and you can use it today. We can't 10 years from now say, what we should do with these deep fakes and these songs that are generated by robots? We should probably legislate them. So is there an affordance? Is there a way to increase the pace of legislation, or do the same kind of legislative style that the tech companies are using? No one's going to get it right on the first. You're going to spend a lot of time thinking about this and putting your suggestions in. We're going to enact some sort of law, and that law is going to be potentially not right for the time, but certainly not right in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So we need to be able to iterate on this stuff faster so that we can keep pace with the change that our society is going through. Because is there a affordance for anything like that, or are we stuck?
Are you asking the senator why he's appearing on podcasts instead of crafting new legislation to handle?
No, I'm just wondering, is there a mechanism? To your point about being an independent senator who can.
Rob, the point you're making is huge, and there's. So I'll give you a real example of that right now. Bill C-27, the new privacy broad stroke legislation that is looking at a new privacy act, so people can actually provide real consent. I mean, the biggest
within an AI component as well, as listeners of this podcast
that's right.
are
So that's the first bit. Second bit is a tribunal for punishing bad actors, and the third bit is ADA, the AI and Data Act. The biggest concerns about ADA right now by innovators and a number of folks is that there's just not enough in it. Too much is going to be in regs and regulations, right? And folks are concerned that there's going to be a whole lot of landmines planted around their business, but they don't know where they are and they don't know how dangerous they are. And is it just a noise, or is it going to kill me? Am I going to be in jail? And that's a real risk. So that's the design of that, to try and adjust to the fact that AI is evolving so rapidly that we need to have regulations. My argument has been and I'm doing my best to convince a number of folks in Ottawa about this, is let's have a lot more around standards, codes of practice, and certifications, so that industry can be involved in a collaborative way through the mechanisms that have been well proven in establishing international standards. But let's have standards that we're adhering to, because those can evolve and iterate quite rapidly. But regulations in Ottawa, once they're made, it takes years to make a change. And so, legislation's really slow, but regulations are not much faster.
Should we just have AI write the regulations?
No, it might tell us to murder each other, but sure.
So that's a great, and I credit to you, funny question. But the answer to that would be that the AI actually wouldn't write anything. It would just take what the lobbyists are giving people because it needs to copy something. I need to kind of take this from you, Senator, for a second, because I want to transition it to something that we're not fully addressing here, which is not even just the time to speed to craft regulation for the technology. And we are current, like these bills that are currently going through our democratic process are finally addressing stuff that's been around for 20 years that I've built my business on, or that has impeded Raine's business as a musician. Like we're just finally getting there now. And there is new technology that might just wipe out these considerations happening today. What we haven't addressed directly on this podcast is the fact that the companies behind these technologies that are monetizing them are making threats to Canadian citizens if we try to regulate their businesses or these technologies. Both Google and Facebook have said that if Bill C-18 goes through, they will prevent, in Facebook's case, the linking of news content. In Google's case, they just won't have it show up in search, which a lot of people complain, oh, is this blocking or not? If you're the number one search engine used by more than 90% of Canadians in Canada and you don't index the results, you are delisting, eliminating information from the web, as is experienced by most Canadians. On the C11 side, you have YouTube, again owned by Google, and TikTok telling creators that if they're forced to just platform Canadian creators in the way that Much Music and the radio stations platformed Our Lady Peace, their algorithms will go out of control, and somehow through the magic of the box, they will be deprioritized in the content. I think we have to, one, acknowledge that this is a mob-like protection racket threat on our country and our sovereignty. Google and Facebook are walking around, the barbershop saying, man, it'd be a real shame if your windows got broken. It'd be a real shame if your news got delisted. It'd be a real shame if you were a Canadian creator and we'd have to make sure you don't get seen by anyone worldwide because your country's trying to ensure that there's a channel that they can see you. We just need to acknowledge that up front as a tension here. And then, I don't know, Rob, do we want to go for a few minutes in disabusing our listeners of some of the arguments that these tech companies are making?
I'm just curious, probably to the senator as well, Colin, like, is that the fight we want to take? Like, and if I were to look to this strictly through the musician lens, it's more important for me at this time and space. And I think probably the problem with tech is like we see this new shiny thing and we become beholden to it. So you think back on MySpace, that was actually a great platform for a few years until something in the leadership changed where they just lost the focus and it just went to hell. But for a minute, it was a great tool that was helping transition into this technological age for an artist. But again, it just went away. The problem is all our data went away. My whole fan list, my email list, all those connections I had spent really blood, sweat, and tears building on a platform where I'd rather be writing a song and recording, but this is what I need to do to move into this 21st century. it went away. TikTok could go away. It could be banned. You have no idea how many creators are on TikTok that have built specifically on that platform. So the idea of being beholden to these companies that really, and I think history's been proving, I mean, ask someone from Vine, like these things do not last. So I think if we all accept that, is the fight really about trying to regulate what type of content, where I would put my kind of eggs in whatever happens, I want the data. I don't want to be beholden to an algorithm, a company, or the fact that they are the ones controlling, owning, and monetizing my data. Some sort of fair value exchange there, I think that's a worthwhile fight from my perspective.
Raine, I think you're under a hugely important point. How do we get somewhere where we have the data portability rights, that we get to control who uses our data for what purpose, for how long, and we get to pull that back? How do we get to the point where Canadians can say, I want to invest my data in a BetaKit or in whatever, in an artist, and I'm happy to share my data with them in return for. And all of a sudden now those creators who were building an audience through blood, sweat, and tears now get to monetize the value of that audience in certain ways. If we don't get there, I don't know where we're going. Because, I asked ChatGPT about whether or not it needs to be controlled in any way, shape, or form, and it absolutely was in agreement that there needs to be regulation and standards to control the use of these technologies that are coming along, that it could be very dangerous and harmful without that. That will change with time. It'll say it's all got it all sorted out within a few weeks in version 5.0. But
to this point, and just for our listeners who can't see the video, Senator basically jumped out of his chair because we had been talking about a data portability and IP right before we started recording. So, Raine, you teed up the senator perfectly. I agree that, and I hear what you're saying in terms of these platforms dying and how difficult it is for creators. And if you want to throw a media publication in the broad creator bucket for the purpose of this conversation, how difficult it is to survive platform changes. And if there was some sort of data portability, we would at least have better access to the way that we are being monetized. Couple caveats to that, I would say. One, we also have to recognize that we're not in the position that Google is to monetize our data the way that we'd be able to. Access doesn't necessarily, and ownership of that data doesn't necessarily breed a solution, because you have to then, as a business person, find a way to monetize that. And that's not easy, particularly given mid-platform tech era epochs. It also doesn't protect against how that data that was owned in that platform is extracted and used for someone else's benefit. Like right now, we literally open up, prior to this recording the podcast, we are having our developer platform SEO meeting, because the more we can do right now to make our site positive in Google's eyes, the more my business and the publication benefits. And that could go any day now. And there's we also can't necessarily prevent the ChatGPT tools from sucking in all of our content to then replace us, because the generative chatbot can just answer what the latest Canadian tech news is without ever linking back to us. So it's not just a ownership, it's also a defense against extraction. The final thing I want to say, and I hope that the senator feels free enough to at least concur with me if he does so on this podcast, is if we want to take our democracy seriously, we have to consider threats against our democratic process to be threats against sovereignty. I completely understand you. Is this the fight that we want to have? I am not saying necessarily that these two bills are even going to solve our problems or the fights that we should be making. But when Google just shows up and says they're going to run a test preventing Canadians from seeing news for 5 weeks, as a democracy, we either kind of strap on the sword and shield and go to war with it, or we are conceding the fact that corporations control how we should behave as citizens. It's honestly why I'm using my Startup Canadian Tech podcast to have a conversation about CanCon, because I am a Canadian citizen. I am a child of democracy. I have a responsibility to the democracy as a citizen. And I grew up listening to people like you, Raine, and others that I would have never known if I was the same age right now. Wouldn't even know where to find them. There was no scene, no community. As you said, there's no geofencing around that. And that breaks my heart, because you are a great creator. You produce great art. And there are so many others like you that are just as creative, were close to successful, that are literally driving Ubers right now because pandemic plus all these other considerations have prevented them from monetizing their work or having a quality of life. And I just, at a certain point, have to say, like, even if this bill kills my business, I would rather our government try to fight against Google, because like, what comes next?
Well, and Facebook has dropped their sharing of Canadian news by 90% over the last 2 years. So, I mean, it's already happened. It's already happening.
And we've seen that.
For me, it's about freedom to operate. Our creators do not have freedom to operate. Our creators create the intellectual property that drives our economy, that pays taxes, that pays for our social programs. I mean, it comes down to creators. And if we can't own our intellectual property and monetize our intellectual property, if we can't own our data and control our IP as a country, I am genuinely concerned. You know, these platforms are not concerned about our ownership of our intellectual property and our data. It's maybe overly simplistic to say that Google and Facebook and other platforms like that just take data and money out of Canada. Yes, there's some salaries, but for the most part, we're at the wrong end of a data vacuum in Canada.
Meta announced today that they're laying off another 10,000 employees. You know, again, the second set of like 10,000 plus layoffs after announcing that they were going to build an innovation hub in Canada.
So we've got to find a way to support creative entrepreneurs and tech entrepreneurs like Raine to come up with a new way of making sure that we get something that's working for Canada. Otherwise, I'm not too sure that we're going to be able to legislate these folks. I know that I'm part of a group that really want to try and make that happen. I believe that we've got to try and make that happen right now, but I don't know. They may just say screw it and back out.
I think that's a strong possibility. They have such strong market share. They have the numbers, and the irony really is, you know, again from my purview, is like these social media sites have become anything but social. You know, they've become algorithms that are just extractive. They basically build higher kind of quarterly revenue numbers off the backs of the creators. And so it's almost like eerily reminiscent, because I lived through this part of it too. It's payola. Like, you can't get any reach on an Instagram post without a paid ad. Probably the same with Facebook.
It's exactly the same with Facebook.
We're kind of like back to square one, just with technology at the forefront. But the system is still as flawed, for me anyway, in the music business, as it was 25 years ago, when you had to pay. You needed to be on a record label, which, you know, would qualify.
Raine,
parallel.
payola is illegal. Why was it illegal for musicians on the radio station, but Facebook, Instagram, Spotify can all do it today because it's digital? That blows my mind.
Well, you know, look, I hate to always bring it back to music, but obviously music business has been incredibly slow to react to new technological advances, you know? So when you look at Spotify, they basically, like, forefront 2 years ago, Elk goes out there and says, hey, you have two choices. If you want to get playlisted, you're going to pay for it, or you're going to reduce your streaming rate. Like, reduce our streaming rate to nothing. It's already nothing. How can we reduce it to try to get more awareness and exposure on this platform? We are in the midst of a new technological payola.
I really wonder in this whether or not there is an opportunity for Canada. This is the thing that I dream about, that our country is trusted around the world. Can we become a safe haven? Can we be the creators of the next platforms that are actually valuing the beginning of the content in a way that allows people to provide a little bit more monetization of their own content, or achieve a little bit more monetization of their own content?
Senator,
is there anything possible?
Senator, with respect, I think those tools currently exist. They have always existed. The minute the decentralization and the democratization happened, that was a possibility. Early Facebook, early YouTube, all of these tools were not algorithmically driven, were open and accessible, and provided access for people to create in a way that they don't have to be in Raine Super Lovely studio. They could be using GarageBand and a laptop on the internet to get that. I think what we're talking about here is it's nothing. Like, technology has the power to affect change at scale. Given it's caused quite a few changes that we've been noting here. It's the businesses that are pushing for the payola that Raine's talking about and are driving those returns, not because the technology demands it, but their business model demands it. It's the same reason why we got rid of cable, only to have 5 to 10 streamers, and now we pay more for all the streamers than we did for cable, and even then we don't get access to the full set of content that we had when we had linear television.
There's nothing centralized about any of these technologies other than one thing, and it is the data. The reason that they don't want to give up the data, it's the gold, right? It is the only thing that makes, if Facebook allowed me to download all of the data on Facebook, I would make Facebook. Then I would be as powerful as Facebook. So they're pushing back the hardest, where I totally understand you, Raine, and I think it is the right thing to do to allow for that kind of data portability. We've never found a killer app that, I've worked on some, they're not killer apps that allow you to control what data you expose it to whom and to when, because no normal person would do that with their time because they're not weird. In fact, you can download your Google data right now if you really wanted to, for the most part. You can even do that with Facebook. It tells you what Facebook thinks you're interested in. No normal person does that because you have no use case for it, because there's no productization of it.
Because it's, Rob, to your point, like to cut you up, because it's not the data, it's what's done with the data. It's the product and the business models.
But having the data, Raine's not wrong in the sense that having the data you've built up over time allows you to control your destiny and choose what platforms you want to go on. The problem is the major platforms don't want you to do that because they want you sticky. The reason we're seeing what we're seeing now is Facebook is dying. Google's worried about Bing and an AI, like you are, Douglas. These are thrashing oligopolies who are nervous about what's next because they can't monetize. You can't get more people, and you could only lose people. And that's where they're going right now. So, Senator, to your point, there is opportunity now to create these new experiences. OpenAI or ChatGPT in this, that is a thread. But what we're going to see again in the next 5 or 10 years is another set of actors who are very powerful, who are not state centralized, who will have the same, I want to control all the information. I want to control everything that I possibly can about you. I don't want to share anything. There's countless examples. Even Apple does it when the newsstand came out. They wouldn't share the subscribers with the publishers. So you didn't know who was subscribing to your apps on those. So this is a pattern that we will continue to see till the end of time, because once this malleable technology can be bent into anything, and then you'll see the power broker is doing it. So I think the general case we need to think about is there are the current powerful folks today who are not, at the moment, they happen to be 98% American, 2% Chinese. Who knows what that's going to be in the next 5-10 years? Hopefully 90% Canadian and 20% or 10% American, whatever. But the set of rules we're going to need to create and the international cooperation we're going to need to engender to enforce those things, because the cost to these tech companies is low for icing out Canada. But if we have an agreement with a few other countries, maybe the cost is a little bit higher.
Oh, like a collective legislative bargaining agreement, possibly amongst Commonwealth countries?
Yes, exactly. Whatever the right structure is. But this pattern will repeat. Because don't forget, Google beat Microsoft because they basically gave the software away for free. Microsoft was a monopoly. Remember, they were almost the one last question that I would have back to Raine is, okay, so you want, as a creator, data portability, so the audience you've built up over time can follow, you can take it and you can choose to put it wherever the heck you want. You also know who they are. The platform doesn't own it. What else would you think you'd want to see as a creator that would help you not get totally fucked every time some new technology platform business model comes your way?
I've honestly given up on, the pillar of portability for many of these big companies, So, and I'm not trying to be self-serving here, but the product that I've been building for the last 3 years is a product called Drops XYZ, which is really about just giving artists the ability to convert as many people at a show. Like all the, we're hitting like 40, 50, 60% conversion rates at a show. So those people, I kind of look at it like this: shame on us as artists, knowing what we know today, if we let fans walk out of a show anonymous. So how do we convert those people into our communities that we own? If they want to manage them on a MailChimp or any of those other services, fine, but you can manage them through us as well. But you can literally export your database in real time wherever you like. And so that is power, because next time you go to that city, and this is all under the premise of this is how artists are making money, playing live, selling merch, right? We're not making from streaming. So our revenue and income streams have been depleted to basically those two things right now. So control of that data and having a direct connection like D2C with your fan base, it's the only future, to be honest. Not to skip forward, but what you guys are saying, even what you said earlier, Douglas, about like Canada's sovereignty and integrity, isn't that why India banned TikTok?
Well, you choose your platform, right? I would say right now, all the global social platforms are dealing with how they run up amongst certain governments, whether you've already seen TikTok here in Canada banned amongst, I think, all levels of government, really. You saw Trump threaten to ban it outright. You have seen Elon with Twitter realize that some of the things he was advocating for before he bought the platform, like he's got his own China and India problems. Like, to Rob's point, there is a huge intersection here between the local and global legislative ideologies and like the business considerations between geography, right? So that's why I feel like it's not just the data, it's how that data is monetized and how it is owned and productized. Because if we had a global set of laws that said, you, Raine, whenever you record or whenever you and your partner record an idea to your phone, you inherently own the rights to that recording and it can be verified and tracked, it would have saved you from the circumstances you detailed the last time you were on the podcast, where you're watching, I don't know if it was the Super Bowl or the NBA Finals or something like that, and a commercial came on and it was a song that you had written and someone had basically stolen that work. Like, if we can get to that level, then I think individual creators can kind of like defend against these considerations. But that's another whole technological layer on top. It means that every piece of data is tracked and being measured. We've got a needle in a haystack problem. And like, we also, need some sort of global coherence when it comes to laws. And as we can see, there are issues on the left of right within each of our countries, let alone between countries here. So I don't know where we got to here other than it's a goddamn mess and we all want to make it easier for Raine and other creators to have this happen. Just let me allow plucky independent media publications that aren't recognized as qualified journalism organizations in their own country. But Senator, can you give us just one last word of hope to wrap this up? Because I normally really enjoy how we go darkest timeline here on the podcast. It's kind of our brand. But for someone who is currently working in one of our chambers of democracy to move forward legislation, I have to hope that you're at least hopeful that we can do something about this.
I'm hopeful that if we get stronger competition law, that if we get stronger privacy legislation, that if we start to really apply the principles of freedom to operate in terms of controlling our intellectual property and controlling our data as an economy, as a society, in ways that we can start to earn the benefits of our creative efforts and of the data that defines who we are. To me, that's where I'm really focused. And if I go back to the CanCon place where we started, Raine, it was about controlling our creative assets and making sure that we catalyzed the value of those assets in Canada and gave our creators the ability to earn a recurring revenue that they could bring up a family on and have a fun time with, I guess, as well in the music industry. But there was something real there that you could build a life around. And right now, unless we gain control of these elements and stop letting tech platforms define our priorities for us, I think we're at a moment where there's a lot of opportunity if we do that. If we don't, I am concerned deeply. And so it's nice to see in Ottawa, for example, the head of the CRTC now is from the Competition Bureau. She has a background in competition law. That's a first, because the last head of the CRTC thought the way to cause competition in the telecom market was to define what the price point was for what services across the industry. No, that's not how competition works. That's not democracy, and it's not competition. So I see hope, but we have got to double down on these issues, and we have to do so, as Rob pointed out earlier, in an iterative way, and we've got to do it in a way that generates recurring revenue from the asset from the data, from the IP and from the data. And those are hard things in this world because the people who are fighting us have more money for more lobbyists and more lawyers than the country put together. So it is a big job.
I think what I've learned, from the music and entertainment business, it's policy that isn't reactive. It's developing the new set of policy that almost has a little bit more foresight and can protect creators for whatever comes, and obviously IP is at the forefront there. And that's, to be honest, that's where we got screwed. You mentioned before, Douglas, like the transition from physical to digital never protected the creators. There was a fair value exchange for the creation, for the music, for the art, and that got just washed away as the three major labels made deals with Spotify.
Yeah. Man, I want to live in a world where you never have to worry about that when you record a song, someone owns the rights to that recording. And I want to live in a world where I don't have to argue to my government that I run a journalism business for a handout to compete against multinational corporations trying to ether me from the internet. But I will say, both you and the senator ended that on a much more positive note than I ever would have expected. So I am incredibly grateful to that. We should pause it here and continue the conversation because this isn't going away. The bills aren't done yet. The response to those bills haven't happened yet. And listeners, depending on how things go, BetaKit might just be a podcast going forward. So thank you.
Douglas, I'm going to be interested in what your listeners have to say about this. Like, for me, that's going to be valuable.
So if they wanted to reach out, who could they contact?
I'll be reading your comments. You can find me on the internet pretty easily, colindeacon.ca.
Raine said it off. It's all about the conversion metrics, right? We've got to make sure that they have the call to action at the end. Otherwise, they will not submit the feedback. If you were moved by any of this, please, you have literally a senator sitting here asking for feedback about stuff that impacts all aspects of art, culture, society, information, technology. Like, if you are a BetaKit podcast listener, I know you have thoughts. Send that feedback, and we will see you on the next episode. The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.